When it comes to video games, I can't create myself that accurately. In Sea of Thieves, I have an afro, which is fantastic. I haven't had one of those since college. Cyberpunk 2077 has some pretty good options, but none of them feel like mine. Unless I'm playing an NBA 2K game, the bar for textured hair is pretty low. Until I played Spider-Man Miles Morales for the first time. The game's got it all. Particle effects, real-time reflections, a mildly accurate version of Manhattan, and a sweet fade that actually looks good. My boy Miles will not be getting roasted on the subway anytime soon.
That is so cool.
But why have I never felt this way about video game hair before? Is it really that hard to give a character a shape up? I spoke to some developers to get an answer to that question and to figure out the process of creating video game hair. Some game studios create their hair in-house, but many actually outsource it to smaller companies. An NPC's hair might take a couple of weeks to create. For a main character like Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn, it could take a little bit more time. Let's ask the guy who'd know, Johan Lithval.
It took me the better part of 2 years probably to create that one hairstyle.
That's wild, right? Well, you're about to learn why, my friend. Before an artist can actually start creating hair, they need to know what it's gonna look like. So they're giving concept art and reference images to base their designs off of. A 2D image is a lot different than a moving 3D object. So references are crucial to understanding exactly what the style should look like from every possible angle. Designers are also given a polygon budget, which determines how detailed they'll actually be able to make the hair. Typically, that number is somewhere between 5,000 and 60,000 polygons.
When we look at hair in a low poly game like Valheim, you really can detect individual strands of hair. It just looks kind of flat. Their budget was between 60 and 300 polygons. Compare that to Aloy's hair, which had a budget of 100,000 polygons. Her hair can run my entire Valheim world 8 times.
So it started off with Aloy having some sort of dreadlocks, I think. And then along the process it changed into more like flowy hair, and then turned a little bit more sort of Vikings-esque type hair with the twists up here and everything. The design changed a lot throughout the process for sure.
Johan's team wound up hiring a hairdresser and a model so that they could recreate the design on an actual person. They then took that design into the computer and started working on it. It took them a long time, in part because Aloy's hair is so complicated, but their process wasn't all that different from the standard approach to making video game hair. Once the design and the polygon budget are nailed down, an artist can begin actually creating the assets. That usually starts with the volume sculpt phase. The artist gets a bald-headed model and needs to create the rough shape of the hair in 3D. They're modeling things like how long the hair is, the flow of the hairstyle, where the hairline is, and the location of the part. This is just to get an idea of the overall shape. The real work begins when they get to the textures. Textures can make or break a character's hair. The average human head has about 120,000 hairs, while Bayonetta has enough for all of us. It would be very difficult, though not impossible, to generate each strand of hair separately. So instead, developers use something called hair cards, which is pieces of digital geometry that have textures applied to them. Sort of like a lasagna wig with hair drawn all over it. Hair cards make it look like they're individual hairs, but the game doesn't run like they're individual hairs. Good textures are the key to making hair look realistic, but they're not the only thing that matters.
I think that the way you layer the hair has a bigger impact than the texture that you apply to each individual hair card, for sure. You know, I can create something that looks voluminous and hair-like using much fewer cards, or polygons basically, if I just make sure to layer them correctly.
10 years ago, video game hair was just one layer on a character's scalp with a texture applied. You can see it in the original Mass Effect's hairstyles, sort of like Lego hair. Nowadays, hairstyles consist of a series of hair cards that are layered, facing outward and parallel to the character's scalp. It's more like comparing Legos to Bionicles. The same thing, but more complicated. Hair artists take those layers and combine them into clumps or chunks. The key is layering them in such a way that looks natural and not too uniform.
So when I kind of move around the camera around this set of planes, I want it to not look like planes anymore. I want it to look like a bunch of individual strands that are kind of going in a similar direction. And then when I have that, I combine it with other pieces of combined set of planes basically, until I have a section of hair, which I can then place on the scalp.
Most hairstyles are made up of 4 different types of cards: base hair cards, structural hair cards, breakup hair cards, and flyaway hair cards. Base hair cards are the larger layers that cover the character's scalp. The player won't really see these cards, so it doesn't really matter too much what they look like. Structural hair cards are placed on top. The hair on these is typically less dense than the hair on the base cards. This is where the volume and style of the hair begin to take shape. Breakup hair cards are added on top of those to define the haircut even more, balancing out the structural cards and ensuring that the foundation is fully covered. And finally, flyaway cards are smaller clumps of hair that fly away from the head to break up the silhouette. Hair that's too perfect starts to look unrealistic, so this adds a little bit of chaos back into the mix. It is also important to remember that well-designed hair has to look good from every angle. Even the dopest style can look flat if it doesn't move right or react appropriately to lighting. This is where specularity comes in. Specularity is the amount of shine reflected by your hair with light.
If you have dark hair, like black hair, and you look at it without specularity, you're not going to be able to read any individual shapes. So your eye in real life is not going to be able to read it as hair. But it's when specular is applied to it where you start reading those shapes, and your brain basically tells you like, hey, this is hair.
Developers apply transparency to the hair textures, which removes everything that's not hair strands. Then they add specular highlights to the surface of the strands to allow the game's lighting to bounce off the hair. These are the basic building blocks of creating video game hair, but each step varies depending on the type of hair, especially when it comes to hair like mine. So far we talked a lot about texture, which developers use to make 3D objects seem more realistic. But now we're going to be talking about hair texture, which is about hair that curls and coils instead of being smooth. When we described creating hair earlier, it was relatively straight strands of hair. Textured hair has more detail and requires more data in order to be rendered correctly.
To make textured hair that has a lot of frizz in it or a lot of coil, basically like any hair that has really tiny shapes in it, you have to rely more on the texture instead of the polygons.
There are many ways for hair to be rendered. One of those involves turning splines into textures. In Maya, an artist can take 2 points and make a line. This is called a spline. Unlike a polygon, a spline has no surface and it can't be rendered unless it's converted into something else. Very straight hair can be made with just 2 points. Wavy hair with a few more. When it comes to curls, the spline has way more than 2 points. Then artists take those curled splines and apply them to hair cards. Curls just take more of the artist's time when creating them. The illusion of digital hair breaks down without high enough textures. This is why games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Skyrim seem a bit off the people who have textured hair. An artist can add more high-definition texture by adding more hair cards, but that pushes the polygon budget to a higher value and requires more processing power.
You need way too many polygons to support that level of detail basically in each individual strand.
Having the processing power of a lot of hair cards is relatively new, which is why I was so surprised to see one of the best looking fades I've ever seen in a Spider-Man game of all places. Having a sweet fade is a sign of maturity for people with textured hair. It shows that you care about your appearance enough to pay a skilled barber to make you a unique silhouette to keep you from being clowned in your group chat. So I talked to the team at Insomniac about why Miles' hair was so important to get right.
We want to give Miles a more relatable hairstyle, and if able to say that, better suited is his role, right? With that hairstyle that is kind of a mix of like real world reference and what you see in the comics. We'll start with the cut reference of how she actually looked, like a full wig look, and then an individual strand reference. So using high quality reference images of Nagi's hair to see how his hair actually behaves, and try to replicate that when given the cut and match the concept and the reference images that the avatar.
Game engines such as the Unreal Engine and the Frostbite engine are rendering individual strands of hair, and as technology keeps evolving, there's an increased amount of polygons available for textured hair. This is what Insomniac Games has been working on with Miles.
So Miles actually has 2 fades. He has his PlayStation 4 fade and his PlayStation 5 fade. So the PlayStation 4 fade is actually a duplicate of the geometry of his skull that is pushed out a little bit, and he uses texture to essentially tell the renderer which pixels we want to render and which pixels we don't.
Basically, on PS4, Miles' hair is literally an extension of his skin that's been colored and textured to look like hair. But the next-gen version takes a next-gen approach. On PS5, Miles' hair is composed of thousands of individually, procedurally generated strands of geometry.
We do a number of techniques to automatically generate different levels of details and also duplicate or instance each individual strand so that we can efficiently generate potentially millions of polygons